Hello, lovely ELSAs. I wanted to put something together for you because the job that you do is always incredibly important. But over the next few months, and in September in particular, you're going to be needed more than ever, and the challenges might be slightly different. So, I just wanted to put together a perspective on the kind of things that you might want to be thinking about and a recap of some of the theories that you might want to be referring to in your work with young people. So the aim of this session is to discuss what ELSA is looking like now and also think about how it might be in September, to revisit some of the key areas and theories in relation to the pandemic, to share some lovely resources with you, and just think about just generally some of the key things that we need to remember. So the situation now, from doing supervision sessions with lots of you, it's been lovely to catch up with you, and it's been really clear that actually everyone's in really different situations. So whatever situation you're in, I just want to reassure you that anything is fine at the minute. There's not going to be any impact on your ELSA accreditation or anything like that, because the network really understand that everybody's situation is quite different at the minute, and in some situations it's not possible for you to practice your ELSA work at the minute, so please don't worry. A few things that just wanted to talk about is the light touch ELSA. So I sent out some information to you a couple of months ago about the virtual light touch ELSA, and the reason I've put ELSA in inverted commas there is that obviously we know that your ELSA work it's a proper intervention, and the nature of it is that it relies on a lot on the face-to-face rapport building that you do and on lots of really lovely resources that you use with them. It's that aren't really possible to do through a virtual way. So the ELSA network have suggested that actually, rather than being ELSA, a nice thing to be doing is obviously keeping in touch and helping them to feel kept in mind, and keeping that relationship with you, but really relying on things like your active listening skills that you did as part of the ELSA course, and just checking in with the children, and talking about things that they want to talk about, rather than actually kind of doing full-on interventions with them. So that's one thing. So I know some of you have been doing that, and some of you haven't, and that's absolutely fine too. I know some of you have been emailing your ELSA children just to keep in touch. I know Sam gave us that lovely example of her growing the sunflowers for all of the children and seeing where they've got to. It's such a lovely way of keeping in touch, and I'm sure everyone else has done lots of lovely things too. So some of you now are doing wellbeing support within your bubble. So you've been placed within a bubble, so you're only able to do kind of wellbeing support with those children, but you're having a really important role in supporting the teacher and supporting the children within that bubble. Some of you aren't in bubbles and you're doing ELSA work as normal, which is great. And then some of you haven't been able to do any ELSA at all, and that is fine as well. So situation in September, I've put this lovely lady on here because quite frankly, who knows? Nobody knows what things are going to look like. We can hope that over the summer things start to get a bit easier. The anxiety kind of generally within society starts to reduce. Those people who haven't been at school yet, and families who have kept their children away, hopefully by September will feel safe enough with their children coming back to school. However, things may not change in that way, and by September, when it is compulsory for those children to come back, you might find that actually some of those children who have stayed at home because they are really anxious and because their parents are really anxious, coming back could be quite difficult for them, and they would have had 6 months away by that point. So there are going to be quite a few challenges there, and you might have challenges of all kinds, which we'll talk about in a minute. So it may be that you're doing individual or group ELSA work as you have been before, but there just might be a bit more of a demand on your time. It might be that you're still not doing any ELSA work at all because there are other priorities and you're needed within bubbles. And as soon as I hear anything else from the ELSA network about that and about that not being kind of okay with your accreditation, then I will let you know. But I think it's all very flexible in terms of what's needed in schools at the minute, and people understand that. And it might be that you're involved in kind of supporting the whole school stroke classes well-being with increased circle times and things like that. It's definitely something that I've been recommending that schools do as part of their universal offer. And they've had all those lovely resources that you put together as well. So it might be that you're still within a bubble, although that bubble may be bigger. And that you're supporting wellbeing in that way, or it might be that you're supporting wellbeing across the staff, which I know a few of you people have been thinking about. So thinking about some of the areas that you're going to need to support, really, it's all the kind of things that you are your bread and butter and that you do every day anyway. But if we go through each of these individually and think about them a little bit, obviously anxiety is likely to be a bit higher in September, especially as you are going to have those children that perhaps haven't come back because they've been quite anxious, or their parents have been anxious and then they're coming back. You might need to be supporting a bit more anxiety there. And we also know that with school avoidance, or emotional based school avoidance, or school refusal, it used to be called, the longer that children are outside school and not in school, the harder it is for them to come back. So obviously with 6 months off school, it's likely that those children who did find school quite an anxious environment to be in, they might find it more difficult. So anxiety is something that you may have to deal with a bit more. Self-esteem, we're going to talk about in relation to Borba's building blocks of self-esteem. Resilience, we'll talk about in relation to the interactive factors framework, or interactive resilience framework, sorry. Social skills, obviously the children have been out of school for 6 months and they might not have had much interaction with other children, particularly those children who are at home and they don't have any other children at home, and they've not really had any interaction with others, or children just starting in reception and they've not had any other interaction with anybody. You may need to do some social skills work. Bereavement, unfortunately, is something that we're going to have to think about. Transitions, preparing children for transitions and changes, or coping with transitions and changes, because that transition will already happen by September. But coping with that, and also just generally understanding the whirlwind and roller coaster of emotions that's going on within them and around them. So revisiting ELSA theory, some of the key ones that I thought it might be useful to have a bit of a talk about. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we covered in the first couple of days of training, but I think it's good to go back to now. The cognitive behavioural therapy hot cross bun model, I think would be good to look back at. Borba's building blocks of self-esteem, the firework model, the anger iceberg, the interactive resilience framework, the active, just thinking about active listening and your active listening skills and the importance of those, and also just 10 kind of top tips to remember in terms of bereavement and loss and coping with that. So just quickly to talk about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. If you remember with this model, it was the idea that we start off at the bottom with those physiological needs, the real basics of basic needs of air and water, food, shelter, sleep. If we have them, we can then move up to the next set of needs, which is our safety needs, which is things like employment, health, property, resources. And then if we have those, we can move up to the next one, which is the love and belonging. So your friendships, intimacy, family, sense of connection. If you have those, you can move up to the top, the next one, which is the self-esteem needs, recognition, strength, freedom, respect. And then finally, if you have all of those ones underneath, you can reach up to what's called self-actualization, which is the desire to become the most that one could be. So it's sort of reaching your potential. Obviously, in this situation, our safety needs haven't been met. A lot of people just haven't felt safe, and that can then impact on all of those that are above that. So self-esteem, recognition, feelings of strength and freedom, absolutely impacted. Our friendships have been impacted, haven't they? And our connections with others, our family situations, and definitely the self-actualization as well, being able to be what you can be. It's been really limiting on all of us. So just bear in mind how you might be able to use Maslow to think about why some of those things haven't been met for some of those children. Okay, for the next one, we're going to look at the hot cross bun model, which is based on the cognitive behavioural therapy. So this is the idea that in any situation, our response really is influenced by our thinking. So if your thought is, I'm going to catch COVID-19 and die, which for some of those children, they will be coming back with that idea that they've been home safe, they've been washing their hands, they've been keeping away from other people, and suddenly they're being thrust into a situation where they've got to be with other people who are a threat to them. There's quite a natural thought for them to have. So if that is their thought, obviously that's terrifying, and that's going to impact on all of those other things. So it's going to impact on their emotions. They're going to feel fear, anxiety, panic, anger. It's also going to impact on their behaviour. They might be wanting to avoid school. They might have difficulty separating from their parents. They might have conflict with others. For example, if somebody isn't so bothered about social distancing and tries to come a little bit closer to them than they would want them to, then that could result in kind of an anger and conflict type response, when really underneath the surface is quite a lot of anxiety. And then it's all going to impact on their bodily sensations. So obviously, if they're feeling that way and if their thoughts are as they are, they may then have the fast heartbeat, sweating, feeling unwell, shortness of breath. As we know, some of those things, the sweating, feeling unwell, shortness of breath, are all symptoms of illness. And so if your fear is, and your thought is, I'm going to catch COVID-19 and die, that can then feed in. So you can see that arrow leading up from bodily sensations to the thoughts and the emotions. So they all lead into each other, and they all cross over. And those bodily sensations can really then kind of reinforce that thinking and that fear and that behaviour. So it's important to think, when you do talk to children about their anxiety around all of this, it's really important to try to identify those negative thoughts that they're having, and then just try to sort of gently challenge them through asking questions like, what is the evidence for the thought? What's the evidence against the thought? Just to try and make a bit more of a balanced thought. Looking at what the probability is that they think that that's going to happen, because for some of them, that, although obviously it isn't it isn't completely irrational, it is obviously always a risk in whatever we do, but it might be that they perceive the chance of that happening as being kind of a 90% chance of happening, which obviously is irrational. So it's challenging that thinking. um, Asking questions like, what would you advice would you give to a friend if they were worried about the same thing, can be really helpful as well. So challenge that thinking, and also try to change the behaviour a little bit as well. So if they are avoiding school, in doing that avoidant behaviour, it then sort of reinforces it all, because they avoid school, then they don't catch COVID and die, and therefore they think that by avoiding school, that's what's sort of made them okay, and it reinforces that worry, and it reinforces the idea that that thought is correct. So it's really important to try and challenge the thoughts, but also do all you can to kind of reassure them and help them to not avoid it, and to test out their negative thinking, and to hopefully find start to feel a bit more safe. This is another theory that we've referred to quite a lot in supervision. I think it's a really helpful one. So this is Michelle Borber's building blocks of self-esteem. And it's the idea that that self-esteem isn't just a unitary thing, it's made up of 5 other bits. And in separating it in that way, it really helps us to think about how to intervene. And you need to have those foundations. The reason it's building blocks is that those 3 at the bottom, they're kind of the foundation, and you have to have those before you can then work on mission and competence. And then you have to have those in order to have good, healthy self-esteem. So if we have a look at some of these and how they might have been affected by COVID and the pandemic and lockdown. Security, clearly a lot of children won't have felt safe, and so that's going to impact it on their feelings of security. Affiliation and sense of belonging. For some of them, being within a class and being within a school, and having those relationships with their teachers and the relationships with the pupils, that's hugely important for their sense of belonging and sense of self. And I know that people have tried to keep in contact through Zoom calls and things, but I think it's really difficult as adults because there's such a different set of social skills that are required for a Zoom call. And when you think about with children, where most of their interactions are based around an activity, it might be around playing football or playing in some way, and then suddenly we're putting them on a Zoom call with probably quite a lot of other people, and then expecting them to be able to navigate the small talk and turn taking and social etiquette of that situation is very different. And I know from a lot of people that I've spoken to, actually, whilst they might have started off doing Zoom calls at the beginning, and they may have kept doing those with family and in kind of small, really small groups, but the ones with their friends have dwindled a bit because it's just not the same, and it just feels so artificial that a lot of children have just not bothered with them. But it does mean that by the time we get to September, there are going to be children that really have lost that sense of belonging and affiliation with others, um, and so we really need to try and help them to regain those connections and those friendships and the social skills, and just that sense of belonging to something, and build up that sense of security that although school before was always the consistent thing, and then suddenly went away, that school can be consistent and reliable and something to be trusted again. Um, and then the other ones kind of follow on from that really, but I think those two are the most important ones to start with. There also might be issues with mission, so the motivation. I know a lot of children haven't felt so motivated when they've been at home, and the feelings of competence as well, because they haven't had that immediate feedback that they would usually be so used to getting so much positive reinforcement when they're at school, where they're doing a tiny bit of work and then being positively reinforced and getting that feedback, and they won't have received so much of that. So there might be children that aren't feeling so competent, and they might have maybe not been able to do as much work as perhaps they would have wanted to at home for a variety of reasons, or they might be comparing themselves to others who they think have done a lot more than them. And so there might be feelings of inadequacy in that way as well, and feeling quite demotivated. So there are lots of areas there that I think could be an area for intervention when we get back. Okay, onto the firework model. The reason that I've included this, because obviously this is a model of anger, but as we know, anger is often a secondary emotion that comes out when there are other things under the surface, like anxiety and frustration and shame, guilt, things like that. So I think this is quite an important one to revisit. And it's just, if you remember, it's the idea that in any situation you're going to have a trigger that for some people might not trigger anything. So for example, maybe getting a lower mark in a test than you wanted. For some children, that won't be a trigger really. That will just be, oh well, never mind, that's fine. For other children, that could be a real trigger, and it all depends on these thoughts and feelings that are the fuse as to whether that fuse gets lit. If your thought is, oh, never mind, I just didn't revise that much this time, but I'll do better next time, nothing else is going to come from that. That'll be it. However, if your thought feeling is, this is because I didn't have a chance to do all the work that I should have done over lockdown because of various reasons, and everyone else is better than me, everyone's going to think I'm stupid, that those kind of thoughts and feelings can then start that bodily reaction of the physiological reaction, and also the just the feelings of anger brewing. So I think the firework model is an important one to remember, because in any time you have a child that's referred to you that's having angry outbursts, just try to identify again what those thoughts are underneath. You'll probably know what the triggers are, although it's really important to find out what the triggers are, but also try and identify what those thoughts are that are in the middle, because that's going to be the key to helping that child to react in a different way. The anger iceberg is just, again, what I was saying before about just remembering that, and I think this is something that you all know, but sometimes other staff don't really realise or forget that behaviour is always a form of communication, and sometimes children might seem very angry, and actually we know that there's a lot of other stuff underneath the surface, and that's where you can really do a job of digging underneath and finding out what it is and really helping them, rather than just helping with anger management strategies, just actually thinking what is it here, what is the thought that this child is having, and how can I help them to think a little bit differently. So on to resilience. This is something called the interactive resilience framework. It isn't something that was covered in the 6 days of initial training, but it's something that we have talked about in supervision more recently. And I think it's a really helpful way of thinking about how we can support children in thinking in responding in a more resilient way. And it's important to remember that you don't have children who are resilient and children who aren't resilient. It's just a matter of how they're responding to a situation. There are lots of things that can help a child to have a better chance of responding with resilience, and it's all to do with kind of protective the way up of the protective factors and the risk factors. So if we can make a child have lots and lots of protective factors and support them with having more protective factors, it's going to help them to have a better chance of responding in a resilient way. So this resilience framework, so this has been put together by Boing Boing, together with Young Minds, and it's got 5 different areas, and these are all through evidence-based research. This is how they've come up with these areas. So we've got the basics. So obviously, in order for a child to respond in a resilient way, again, those basics, like with Maslow, the basics are really important. So having good enough housing, enough money to live, feeling safe, having a healthy diet, etc. You've then got belonging. Relationships are just hugely important in being able to respond in a resilient way. So things like being able to tap into good influences, keeping relationships going, predicting good experiences of someone or something new, learning. So keeping on with learning helps to build resilience. Coping and encouraging them, giving them ways of coping, and then core self. So in things like instilling a sense of hope, helping them to know themselves. So all of these things, evidence tells us, are protective factors that help children to respond in a resilient way, even when they've had potentially really awful experiences during lockdown, or just really negative environment at home. They can still respond in a resilient way, and these things are all the things that help them. The reason that I've highlighted all of those ones in yellow, if you saw the other video that I made for school staff, you've heard me talk about this before, so I won't bang on about it too much. But all of these things in yellow are all the protective factors that actually they may not have had because of schools closing. So for example, that top one, find somewhere for the child to belong. We've talked already about the fact that actually school for some children is that place where they belong, that place where they've always been able to rely on to be the one thing in their lives that's quite consistent, suddenly shut down, and at quite short notice left them in a very, very different situation to have to kind of cope with, without the support of all of people like you, and people like their class teachers and their friends. So there are lots of things, if you have a look through those, and I'll give you a chance to have a look through those as I'm talking rather than go through each one of them individually, but there are lots of things that children haven't had access to because of lockdown, which decreases the chances of them being able to respond in a resilient way. So I'd really recommend using the interactive resilience framework as a way of planning how you can support a child to increase their protective factors if you're thinking about doing something about resilience and coping with a child. And the reason it's called interactive resilience framework is because when you look this up online, if you go to Boing Boing or Young Minds and find this, if you click on any one of those squares, if you click on the writing, it'll take you down to the reason that bit has been included within the resilience framework. So it tells you what the evidence is, and it gives you kind of examples of what it means, especially for some of them where it's perhaps not so obvious what they mean. So it's a really good resource, so please use that one. Right, active listening. So this was something that we did cover on that 6 days of initial training for being an ELSA. And this is one of the most important skills that you should be using ideally in every ELSA session that you have. And I know lots of you have been using this during your Zoom calls or your phone calls home. So active listening, if you think about when you have any kind of problem or you're upset about something, and then you tell somebody and they start coming up with solutions, it's awful, and it's really annoying, and it just makes you feel completely like they've not listened or understood, or taken the time to just allow you to talk. And often, just by being able to talk to somebody and having that space to be able to talk and have somebody just listen without coming in with their own problems, it's quite a well, it's a situation you don't really get usually unless you're in a situation, as they will be in those ELSA sessions, where you're there to just listen to them. So these active listening skills are really important, and it's really important to just listen, empathise, not try to solve the problem, but give them the tools to be able to think about how they might move forward and what might make them feel better and what things they feel that they could do or what they feel that other people could do to be able to help them. Using active listening skills like summarising, so allowing them to talk and then just kind of summarising and paraphrasing back to them what you've understood by what they've said, and having a look, if making sure that you have understood. You might want to reflect back to them some of their feelings. So they might have said something to you and you might say something like, it sounds like you're feeling really angry about that. And then they might agree with you, yes, I am feeling really angry, and carry on talking. Or they might say, well, actually, no, I don't feel angry. I just feel really upset, which also is good. And that'll mean that they're labeling their feelings. And by labeling the feelings are going to reduce in intensity. So active listening skills and empathizing are one of the best tools that you can use with young people in lots of different situations. And finally, bereavement and loss. Hopefully something that you won't have to do too much of, but it could well be that you've had children that have experienced loss during this period. And obviously it's always a horrible thing to have to go through. But this situation has meant that it's been that bit harder for those children and people who've experienced bereavement, because they haven't been able to say goodbye in the same ways. It might have been people that they hadn't seen for a little while. It might be that they weren't able to go to the funeral. So there are lots of reasons that it could have been even more difficult for them. It might be that it was a bereavement within their family, and whilst usually you'd be able to grieve at home and then maybe go to school and have a little bit of light relief to take your mind off it and focus on other things, they've not had any of that. They've just been at home within that grief, pretty consistently. So this is something probably that you're going to come across when you come back, and even if you don't, it's always one of those things that's just really worth refreshing your memory on every now and again, just to make sure that you're prepared if you ever have to deal with this. So I've just put together 10 key things just to remember if you are dealing with somebody who's been through a bereavement or loss. So first thing, all of their feelings are normal. It might be that they feel very sad or angry or a sense of relief in some situations. If they've been poorly for quite a long time, they might feel guilt, and just reassure them that all of those feelings are okay. They might feel angry at other people, they might be blaming other people. Just listen and reassure them that everything they're feeling is totally normal. Next one, all of their questions are okay and safe to ask. So just try and be unshockable. Because children develop at different, through the developmental phases, children have different understandings of death. And certainly around kind of the age of around sort of 5, 6, 7, when they're starting to understand death a little bit more, they can become quite curious, and some of it can seem a little bit morbid and seem quite inappropriate, the kind of questions that they might ask. But all it is they're just trying to understand. They just don't have a good understanding of death at that point, and they're trying to trying to get a better understanding, and they might see you as the safe person that they can actually ask some of those questions to, because they can't ask them at home, because everyone else at home is really upset as well. So it might be that they ask you some questions that you deem a bit morbid and a bit inappropriate, but it's just really important to remember they're not trying to be morbid and inappropriate. They're trying to gain a better understanding, and just not to be shocked, and answer all their questions, and not kind of tell them it's inappropriate or anything. Just answer it truthfully in an age appropriate way. Third one, use the right language. Language is a really important one around this, especially with young children. It's we want to protect them, don't we? And we try to use language like they've passed away, or they've gone to sleep, or they've gone to a better place. And actually all of that can be really, really confusing. And the phrase "gone to sleep" can be terrifying, because then children can worry about going to bed and going to sleep themselves, and what if they never wake up? So it's really important actually to just not use any of those euphemisms, and to just use the language of death and dying and dead, as much as they feel a little bit more difficult. It's much better to use that kind of language. The next one, the process of grief is not linear. So I think people used to kind of believe that there were stages in our response to death. Things like going through kind of anger and things like that. And whilst there are those stages, and there are common ways that people respond, it's not a linear process where you go through this stage and then you're on to the next one and then you're on to the next one. It's better thought of as kind of a cycle, where you'll go through one emotion and then you'll go through another emotion, and then you might come back to an emotion, and then you might have times when you feel all right, and then it all comes back again. And it's really important to remember that there's no time frame on that either. It's not something where, oh good, they've gone through that stage, now they're onto this, so they should be through it within the next couple of weeks. It just doesn't work like that. And we know that. Anyone who's been through grief will know that it's not something that you can necessarily, after a certain period of time, get over. You just kind of learn to live with it in a different way. So it's not a linear process. Be consistent and dependable. They're really gonna need you, and being able to have somebody consistent and predictable and dependable, that is always going to be there for them in school at a certain time on a certain day, is going to be really important for them, because they've, in a sense, especially if it's a parent that's died, they've been abandoned. Really, they have a sense of abandonment, and so it's really important to be that consistent, safe person for them. Don't rely on talking. And I know I don't really need to say this to all of you ELSAs, because you do lots of lovely different things, but you really make use of all of those lovely resources on the ELSA support website, and the other resources that you've got through the files that I've sent to you, which I'll attach to the email when I send this as well, that have all of those lovely resources in, because you want to be looking at doing drawing and playing and poems and craft and making things, rather than just relying on talking, because it's really hard to talk about, especially at the beginning. Help them to process their feelings and find ways to remember. One of the things that children tend to be most worried about when they're grieving is that they're going to forget that person. So helping them with ways to remember and thinking about some of the positives is really important. Again, I've said this before, avoid the phrase, "I know exactly how you feel." So it's important to empathise, but don't say that. Remember that after the intervention, the child would still need check-ins. So generally, when somebody dies in a child's life, at the beginning, they might not really have started to process it properly, and they'll have lots of people around them giving them lots of support. And then after a couple of weeks, everybody else starts to move on and move past it, and kind of get on with their lives, whereas that child's still very much in that situation and dealing with that grief, and probably just starting to process it as everybody else has started to move on, and that can be really difficult. So just remember that whilst we don't want the child to end up being dependent upon us, after you've done the initial sessions and you've supported them through that time, just make sure that you always go back and check in with them, and make sure that they know that then you know that it's still going to be really difficult for them, and that you're still keeping them in mind, and understanding how difficult it must still be for them. And last thing, but by no means least, because it's really important, know your own limits, because supporting children or anybody through bereavement and loss is really tough. And if you've been through a bereavement or loss, not even necessarily recently, but if you feel that actually you can't do this and it's going to be really difficult for you emotionally, just know your limits, and feel completely within your rights to not do that, because that's completely okay as well. Okay, so now on to sharing some resources with you that are just some nice little bits that I've seen being shared on Twitter. Because I know all of you access all of the stuff that's on that lovely ELSA support network, ELSA support website. But I thought some of these things you may not have seen, and some of them are quite nice. So there's one here that I think is really useful. This was shared by School Counsellor. So if you are on Twitter, definitely want to follow. And it's just my return to school circles of control. So we know that when children are feeling anxious about things, they might be anxious about lots of things that are completely outside of their control. And knowing the things that they can control and focusing on those can be a really good way forward. So I thought that was quite a nice visual to share with children. This one's also lovely. I think this was shared by the same, yep, this was on the same, from the same person. All about endings, because it's so difficult for the children, amongst other things. They've missed out on the kind of closure of that school year, and perhaps the closure on school altogether. So doing an activity like this with them before the end of the year can be really nice. Thinking about the emotions that they felt at the beginning of the year, halfway through the year. Now I'm coming to the end of year, I can look back at the roller coaster ride and reflect on my thoughts, feelings, and actions I'm grateful for. I will remember. I have learned to, and it just gives them a bit of closure and helps them to think about the year in a holistic way. These are nice as well. So especially for those children that are still at home, this might be a nice thing to send over to them. And you can get this. I'll send the PowerPoint round, as well as the link to watching this, so you can have access to it. But it's just every day filling in one of these cards, just to get you off on a good start, and then thinking about positives throughout the day, and then thinking about things you're grateful for. Because we know that when we did that supervision session on happiness and positive psychology, we know that things like doing the random acts of kindness and gratitude letters, and positive diaries, they all really, really help with increasing positivity and happiness. So that's quite a nice thing, I thought. And these as well. So these are by Dr. Karen Treisman, who you may have heard of. She's got a brilliant website called, I think it's called Safe Hands, Thinking Minds. And she's made lots and lots of resources. But this was one that she shared for free, and I thought this could be great for ELSAs in terms of trying to work out what it is that the children want from you, and how you're going to be able to help them using these tokens, take what you need tokens, of what it is from all of those things that they feel that they really need to be able to help them. And I think that can probably tell you quite a lot. So you can use them in loads of different ways, but I just thought it's quite a nice child friendly visual. And then just finally this one, which I think is good for the older children actually, and really good for staff, and good for the younger ones too, and good for us. So it's just checking in with my stuff. So how am I feeling right now? My top 3 to-dos of things that you must do. It'd be cool if I could, and then now I'm just showing off if I do. And then things that are playing on your mind, stuff you can control, stuff you can't control. Doing some lovely self-regulation tool there, the square breathing, and then just knowing 3 things that will help to fill my cup. So I just really like that. I think there's lots of the lovely techniques that we use anyway, but all on one sheet. So that's another one there for you. And then finally, just to finish off, this is our last slide, and I just wanted to share with you some nice resources that are out there that you might want to have a look at over the summer. So this is a lovely book that's on pre-order at the minute, but it's going to be released in time for, hopefully in time for September. a toolbox of well-being, so lots of strategies for children, teens, carers and teachers. And I know obviously Tina's resources are always lovely, and this is only £12.99 at the minute on pre-order, so it's very affordable. I think you can get it on Amazon on pre-order, or you can get it from the publisher, which is Hinton House. So that's a good one to have a look at. There's also Tina Ray has done some YouTube videos, which you may or may not have seen, but she's done, I think she's on to about number 12 now, and they're hour-long training sessions on all kinds of things. So there's one on self-esteem, there's one on bereavement, there's one on using CBT kind of approaches, anxiety, eating disorders, literally an hour of free training on so many different things. So make the most of them, because that's such a valuable resource. So if you just search on YouTube for Tina Ray, you'll find all of those. They're called like coffee break training. Also there's something called Learning and Wellbeing Psychology. They've put together some nice little clips. They're just 10 minutes. They're called Starters for 10 on a few different things. There's one all about Maslow and how Maslow relates to the pandemic and supporting children. So that could be a good one to have a look at as well. And then finally, there's something called EP Reach Out, which has been put together by Southend Educational Psychology Service, and they've put out all the way through lockdown, they've put out a YouTube video every single day of different psychologists and different people within the well-being sphere talking about different things, and there are some really brilliant ones on there that could be good to have a little look at. So do have a look at all of them if you're thinking that you could do with a bit of extra CPD or some ideas, then they're all really good places to look. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this has helped to just refresh your memory on some of those topics that we talked about so long ago now, and help you to feel a bit more ready for now and for September. But please do email me anytime, and we will have hopefully some face-to-face supervision in September, October time, and I really look forward to seeing you all. So have a lovely summer and keep in touch. Thank you. Bye.